We turn now to our political panel. We want to welcome Carol Lee to the broadcast. She is the White House correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor-in-chief at The Atlantic. Reihan Salam is the executive editor at the National Review and a National Review Institute Policy Fellow. And Mark Leibovich is the chief national correspondent at the New York Times Magazine. Welcome to all of you. Carol, I want to start with you. The government needs funding or else it's going to shut down. The OMB director at the White House has said to reach a deal, they will give Democrats $1 for Obamacare funding if they get $1 for the president's border wall, which Democrats don't want to fund. So is that going to solve it?
Well, it got a pretty quick rejection from the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer, who said it's a non-starter, and they're not going to negotiate that. But it's emblematic of two things. One is the president really wants a victory before the 100-day mark, particularly on some of his most significant campaign promises, like the border wall. The second thing is they need Democrats on board if they're going to avoid a shutdown, which the White House would like to do. So that's part of the reason why we've seen them leave open the possibility of not digging in on the border wall funding. That's also why we've seen them try to make a last-minute reach at taxes or health care. Two things that on a good day for Congress would be really complicated and difficult, never mind that they're trying to avoid a shutdown. And so, but at the end of the week, what it sounds like we may wind up at is a place that's very conventional for Washington, where we get a one-week continuing resolution so they can continue negotiations, and then perhaps look at health care in the following week.
Right. So, Reihan, let me ask you this. Congressman Tom Cole, a Republican, said this about the politics of a possible shutdown. He said, even our most recalcitrant members understand that if you shut down the government while you're running it and you control the House and the Senate, you can't blame anybody but yourself. Does he have the politics of that right, do you think?
It's not entirely clear, partly because President Trump is a different animal. He's someone who could lay blame at the feet of Congress if he so chose, and that's why there's so much uncertainty here. The deeper issue is, for Republicans, they've been trying to get to regular order. That is, a kind of regular, ordinary way that we're supposed to have legislation. It goes through committees, then you vote on it, then you have a conference committee, all this other stuff. Instead, the only way we ever pass anything is when we cram everything into omnibus, must-pass legislation where someone's going to die. It's like, this kitten is going to die if we don't pass this right now. And the upshot of that is that you get legislation that is not scrutinized. You get all kinds of terrible decisions crammed into this stuff, and this is not a sane, reasonable way to govern. The question is, how can you actually press reset? The expectation had been on the part of Republicans in Congress, you get a Republican president, maybe we can take a breather and actually do this the normal way. But the Republican president we got is Donald Trump, and we go back to the brinkmanship. And the things that Mick Mulvaney is saying about the possible deals,
OMB director.
Exactly, it doesn't actually add up. These are not deals that Democrats are willing to make. You send everyone right back to their brinkmanship kind of position.
Right. So, Mark?
I also think Democrats aren't as worried about a government shutdown as a opposition party normally would be. I think that the Democrats believe, probably rightly, that the Republicans control every branch of government. And traditionally, President Obama, experienced some actually political success when Republicans, who controlled the House and the Senate, shut down the government. Same with Bill Clinton in the 90s. I think in this case, Democrats feel like they have a great deal of leverage. And what's interesting is that as you approach this 100-day marker, when you're trying to break up a no-hitter, this is a baseball analogy, you're trying to break up a no-hitter, you don't swing for the fences, you try to get a single. And legislatively,
in this case, the president's trying to break up the no-hitter.
Correct. Okay. He's accomplished nothing legislatively, right? Justice Gorsuch, is legislatively maybe. But, there is nothing he has accomplished. And, this is not going to be a big victory you're just going to get by imposing a deadline on Congress.
Jeffrey, I'm going to dismount from the baseball metaphor and ask you about the rest of the world. Marco Rubio made this case that if Congress can't get its act in gear on funding, that it will send, he said, catastrophic message to the rest of the world. What did you make of that?
It's a big word.
Yeah.
It's not the only signal we're sending to the world in recent days that might leave the world a little bit doubtful about where we are and who we are and whether we're fulfilling our responsibilities. It is true that allies and adversaries alike watch Washington. They assume, because we are the world's sole remaining superpower, that we have our act together. And when we don't have our act together, that sends difficult signals. But again, there's a panoply of difficult signals that are coming out of Washington. So I wouldn't call it catastrophic. I would say at a moment of heightened tension in the Korean Peninsula, and obviously the issues surrounding Iran and Syria, a recent strike in Syria, is not the moment to signal to the world that we can't even keep our government running.
Carol, as Mark pointed out, the president's trying to swing, healthcare taxes. Give us on healthcare. There was a blip that there might be something. Was there something going on last week about reviving the replacement to the Affordable Care Act, or was that kind of wishful thinking?
There's been an effort going on. The Vice President, Mike Pence, has worked on this. He's obviously been traveling in the last week. But there's the conservative, the moderates, and the Freedom Caucus in the Republican Party are trying to work together to come up with some sort of compromise. What they've come up with is something that is a bit cosmetic in terms of the differences that it has with the failed health care bill a few weeks ago. And so it's not clear that it'll actually go anywhere. And even if it goes somewhere, right now the White House's argument is they consider it a victory if they get something passed in the House. Well, it still has to go through the Senate, and it's not necessarily, it doesn't guarantee that it's actually going to go anywhere.
And as one senator said to me, anything that pleases the Freedom Caucus in the House is going to have bigger problems among Republicans in the Senate. Reihan, also as a part of this beat the clock game to get things done before the 100 days, the president looks like he's going to announce his tax plan. That seems faster than we would have expected it. Explain what you think will happen when you introduce a big tax cut plan in the midst of this environment that you've been describing.
Well, one possibility is that if you're not actually going to get legislation that can get past a filibuster, what you're going to have is a temporary tax cut. It's going to be something that's going to be a bit more crowd-pleasing potentially and a bit narrower in scope. Because Republicans, what they've been working on is getting a big border adjustment package that would give them the revenue they'd need in order to do a variety of other things to make the tax code more investment-friendly, more growth-friendly. But of course, the border-adjusted tax is dividing Republicans. And so what we might wind up seeing is something that is, a little more narrowly political, a little more stimulative. What Treasury Secretary Mnuchin has said is that we want to focus on a middle-class tax cut. We've heard that again and again and again. What exactly is that going to be? A middle-class tax cut is not what pro-growth, supply-side Republicans are most enthusiastic about, right? What they care about is a corporate tax cut. What they care about is high-end tax cuts. So it's possible that we will see something from Trump that is very, very different from what we've been talking about to date, namely something that is focused on his constituency. That would be, in my view, politically smart, but again, it doesn't actually do much to get the Republican leadership on side.
Mark, focused on constituency. Give me your sense of that. The president has, he is in this interesting position. He's a Republican, but he's also got his own constituency, and that's why a fight over the border wall on government spending, isn't that putting him right back in the center of what brought him, which is to say his focus on the border, and maybe it threatens a shutdown, but he's keeping his eye on the prize?
Yes, he has great confidence that his supporters are for a border wall, and he's probably right about that. The problem is his supporters right now, have not scaled at all since he's been elected, at all. It's also unclear where the country is on a border wall. If you polled people who voted for Donald Trump, you're going to get very, very high numbers on a border wall. There's no consensus, even on the Hill itself, that this is something that is worth, really having a sort of knockdown, drag-out fight for, especially on the eve of a government shutdown. We're talking, again, taxes, healthcare, border wall. These are not small things when you actually have an area of need, i.e. keeping the government open, that's coming down, in 5 days from now.
Right.
So,
Jeffrey, I want to switch a quick question about international affairs. The president this morning tweeted, quote, very interesting election currently taking place in France. What have you made of his occasional forays into the French election?
That sounds like he should be a panelist on a panel and discussion. Fascinating election. What he's doing, it's a very sort of passive aggressive thing, because we've seen him earlier this week say, I'm not endorsing Marine Le Pen, the far right candidate, but she's really great on this subject and that subject, borders especially. We're in a novel moment, obviously, in American European relations, or in let's say the history of presidential interventions in overseas elections. She is the far right candidate. Her party, the National Front, has its roots in Vichy fascist ideology. This is somebody on the furthest most right. So an American president coming out and saying, I'm not endorsing, but in essence endorsing, is really something that we haven't experienced before. And of course, if she wins, she makes it through this round and gets to the second round and even possibly wins, we're looking at the end of the European experiment, the end of the post-World War II European experiment, and Donald Trump has been sympathetic to that idea. He's been very hostile to the EU. He's intermittently hostile to NATO, as we've seen over the years. So he's clearly trying to put his thumb on the scale while being a little bit cute about it.
Reihan, what do you make? There are a lot of foreign policy developments this week. We've been talking about North Korea. The president made a phone call to Erdogan of Turkey about his victory. And then this discussion about the French election. What do you make of the president and his foreign policy? Are these totally independent decisions? Do they follow a pattern of any kind?
Well, I think that there's oftentimes a tendency to want to impose a narrative on what's been going on. So, for example, the fact that President Trump congratulated President Erdogan. Well, look, I mean, President Obama congratulated President Putin on his re-election victory back in 2012. That didn't necessarily mean that President Obama thought that Putin was a great guy. Similarly, we just don't know exactly what Donald Trump thinks about Erdogan and the political changes within Turkey domestically. As for North Korea...
You're assuming he has thoughts about it, actual thoughts.
Or rather, it's something that he is thinking about, puzzling through, and also I think that we've seen that his mind changes from time to time, right? Which, makes sense, which we'd expect.
Well, he's definitely focused on ISIS and Turkey's role in possibly helping with
Right, and that's very complicated, right? Yeah. Because, I mean, the Turks, they want to be the tip of the spear. They want to be sure that it's Syrian Arabs who are the ones who are taking out ISIS, whereas the United States has been working closely with Syrian Kurds, and the Turkish government believes that these guys are terrorists. So, I mean, that's enormously complicated, and of course North Korea is too.
I think what you're seeing in his foreign policy is his transactional nature is playing out in that, what he said in congratulating Erdogan, which, White House officials said he wanted to do, particularly just so he could try to put Turkey in a place where he might be able to get something that he wants from them on the Islamic State fight, and that it was worth taking criticism that the U.S. is hypocritical on its preaching democracy. And you've also, this is a president that likes to be praised. And so you see him offering praise to Erdogan. You saw him do this with Egypt, which they felt that resulted in him getting this aid worker released. He's done that with President Xi Jinping of China. And so it's kind of how you see how he's operating. He's doing these sort of praising people who we would not necessarily praise and trying to get some sort of transactions from them.
Well, yeah, I also think that what we're seeing, I mean, I think in a way the current foreign policy environment suits his fairly situational approach to the world. I mean, he was praised for Syria, for instance, and what was the next sentence every pundit in the world said after that? Oh, what's the strategy? I mean, by the time we were onto the strategy, we're back to North Korea, we're in Turkey, we were in Egypt or something. So I mean, I think he's also well situated with pretty strong advisors at this point. I mean, I think McMaster, to some degree Tillerson, certainly Kelly, certainly Mattis are people he's gotten pretty comfortable with pretty quickly. And again, the situational format I think suits him well.
Let me speak on behalf of the strategy-loving pundit class and say that you can have transactions for a while, but these problems pile up because transactions don't solve the problems. You need an actual strategy to figure out what we're doing in Syria. You need an actual strategy to figure out what you're doing in North Korea. No sign of any strategy.
Well, we've had a transactional strategy in North Korea for the last 20 years.
I was going to say that, yeah.
Here we find ourselves.
All right, well, the transaction I must transact is that we are out of time. So we'll be back in a moment with some thoughts about civility.
Yeah.